Hi, welcome. My name is Tarek Hassan. I'm a professor of economics. It's my pleasure to welcome two of my esteemed colleagues for our conversation today. We have Adam Guren, who's a professor of economics and fellow at the National Bureau of Economic Research, an expert in macroeconomics, housing, and monetary economics. And we're also joined by David Lagakos, another one of our colleagues, professor of economics at BU, also a fellow at the NBER, specializing on growth, economic development, and kind of the macroeconomics of emerging markets. Our topic today is very topical, I would say. It's why does Fed independence matter? It's a topic that, used to make our students yawn and yeah, whatever, Fed independence, but there have been recent challenges to this idea that the Fed should be managed by experts and not by politicians, and that's what we're going to be talking about today. I first want us to talk a little bit about why the Fed is independent and the political temptation to juice the economy before elections to make the president or whomever is running the country more popular. I guess I want to jump right in. Adam, why is central bank independence so important?
Thanks for having me here. Let me give the short version first. Politicians are always going to have the temptation to want to stimulate the economy, get growth going, lower interest rates, make everyone happy. But they'll never want to hit the brakes on growth or cause a recession. And this is particularly true when it's politically convenient. As you mentioned, there's this term called the political business cycle, where politicians are incentivized to get reelected, might try to juice the economy. But the problem is that if the Fed repeatedly lowers rates and stimulates the economy, we'll have some inflationary booms. Eventually, people's inflation expectations are going to rise, and what we'll end up with is 1970s style stagflation. And as Paul Volcker showed, the cost of bringing down inflation is a really severe recession. So it's usually best to avoid inflation getting out of control in the first place. And because of the incentives politicians have, the idea is to have a committee of experts who are politically insulated doing that.
How does the Fed juice the economy? How do they do that exactly?
So by lowering interest rates, that increases economic activity. Businesses start to invest. Households might buy a house or buy a car. That picks up economic activity. At the same time, that'll also pick up inflation because it's expanding the money supply. So all of these things are going to kind of cause an inflationary boom. The other reason that kind of more recent why we might want independent Fed is Congress has just been gridlocked in political morass. And so the idea is to have this committee that's really nimble and can act quickly. So we have 7 governors with 14-year terms, and then a rotating cast of 5 regional Fed presidents on the Federal Open Market Committee, which is the committee that makes monetary policy. And they're only approved by the Fed with the governors who are appointed by the president. So this is a very insulated body. I think, I'm teaching a course on macroeconomic history. I think it's worth, in terms of delving in this in a little bit more depth, to kind of look at history. And I think it surprised a lot of people that central bank independence is actually a very new idea. So really, the first great fight over the central bank's independence came in 1951. In World War II, the Fed was very much in the backseat. It was basically an arm of the Treasury Department helping finance the war effort by keeping rates low. And then in the Korean War in the early 50s, inflation kind of surges to 10%. And Truman hauls the Federal Open Market Committee that makes interest rates into the White House, insisting that it is their patriotic duty to keep interest rates low while the boys are off fighting at war. And after they leave, he issues a statement that they had pledged their support. But that is not what they thought they did. And so they issued a contradictory statement. And there was this big fight over independence that ended up in what was known as the Fed Treasury Accord in 1951. And Truman's solution was actually quite clever. What he did was give the Fed its independence, but he, at the moment, was able to appoint a new Fed chair. And so he picked the guy who negotiated the accord for him, the Assistant Treasury Secretary, William McChesney Martin, basically expecting him to be a stooge. And what happened was actually the opposite.
But so Adam, but being a stooge, does that mean like allowing high inflation basically?
So in this case, yes, he said, don't go against our boys. Why would you raise interest rates in the face of them? But he did. He kept rates high, and the next time Truman sees him, he yells at him for being a traitor. And this independence comes up and is challenged again and again over the next 20 years, even though the Fed is formally independent. So I think the best example is another example where the cost wasn't really elections or anything, but was patriotism. So in the late 60s, we're in the Vietnam War. LBJ does not want anybody doing anything challenging his authority on this war. And so what he does is when Martin starts to raise rates, he summons him to his Texas ranch and he actually physically assaults him. He throws him against the wall and yells at him, "My boys are dying in Vietnam and you won't print the money I need."
It's kind of funny if you've ever been to a central bank, it's a pretty boring place, right? With like people in kind of like well dressed and
Absolutely.
walking around
But as
and,
we
and
know, Johnson was quite an
yeah, and the notion that they
presence.
would be participating in the war is also interesting. So
So Martin
essentially,
backs off
yeah,
and inflation hits 6%. Martin says he's been a failure. And then in the 70s is really when the idea of this independent central bank that's like truly independent is birthed for two reasons. The first is the Bretton Woods peg breaks. So the dollar used to be pegged to gold. That's no longer the case. The Fed is the only thing standing in the way between us and inflation. And the second is we had this big surge of inflation in kind of two surges. And in response, Paul Volcker raises rates to 20% and persists keeping rates high and kind of choking the economy, even as unemployment goes up to 9, 10%. And he eventually, after a very deep recession in 1982, brings inflation to heel. And the idea of the independent central bank is really that the Fed always has to be in a position to be willing to do what Volcker did. And no politician is going to be willing to do that. Of course, Jimmy Carter famously lost his job because of what Volcker was doing. And so the idea is we have these kind of independent, nimble central bankers who have the authority to really put their foot down on inflation in a way that politicians would never be able to do.
yeah, which sort of means that they have to be in a position to do things that the president really doesn't want. So you're saying
Absolutely.
Jimmy Carter lost the election because economic growth stalled because of the tight monetary policy?
In that case, yes. I mean, that was before this is kind of a double dip recession, but he lost his job kind of in the first dip. But Reagan kind of let Volcker do his thing, and we enjoyed an era of kind of 40 years of low inflation until the aftermath of COVID, where the Fed was doing a great job with things. Fiscal policy was kind of in the back seat, and this idea of this independent central bank became very sacrosanct in a way that is very, very central to a lot of modern macroeconomics.
We'll get back to that. I want to bring in David to the discussion. So David is an expert in developing and emerging markets. David, you spent years working across the developing world. Adam just described the political temptation to juice the economy before an election. But in lots of the world, there's sort of a second, maybe even bigger pressure on central banks that we often don't think about, which is when the Treasury just runs, when the government runs a chronic deficit that it can't pay for, and eventually kind of turns around and say, hey, I thought, you guys over there, aren't you the ones printing the money? Can I have some of that? Like, can you talk a little bit about this?
Sure. Yeah, I spent a lot of time thinking about how developing countries can sort of get better and turn into richer countries like the US. But yeah, it's like, what happens if the Fed becomes less independent? We're going to go down that sort of path. So what sort of the stylized story would be politically, there's a lot of motivation to do big spending projects, maybe not as much excitement about raising taxes. Maybe in some places it's just very hard to raise taxes. So now you have this big deficit and you say, what do? We don't have the money. So you take a piece of paper and you write on it, I owe you, and you write a large number, and that's called a bond. And then you issue bonds. If you can sell them in the market, that's great. But most low-income countries, they have a hard time selling bonds. So then you sell them to the only person who has to buy them from you, which is the central bank. And the central bank may not want to buy it. So I could give examples, but in Argentina recently, they tried to get the central bank to buy Some of these IOUs, the central bank didn't quite want it. They fired the head of the central bank, replaced them with a political person. The political person said, "Oh, we'd love to buy those things." And how did they pay for it? They printed money. And then that's how the inflation started. And so I'm referring to Argentina, but there's many other instances where it works something like this. Like in Turkey, I'd love to talk about Turkey, but yeah, there's many instances where it's just like this, and they start by forcing the deficit on the central bank who prints money, and then you're buying goods by printing money. That's what you're doing, and then inflation is sure to follow, and probably not take very long either.
So we're saying it's an alternative to taxation, basically, right? So you just basically turn around and tell the central bank to print the money that you want to spend. And what then happens is that more and more money is chasing fewer goods so that the money is worth less than you were hoping, which
Right.
means inflation. Adam,
And
when
this can really spiral out of control, right?
yeah, I was gonna, okay, can you weigh in on
one
this?
of my
Yeah.
favorite pictures in the history of economics is from the German hyperinflation in the early 20s, where prices were going up so quickly and so fast that the cheapest way to buy blocks for your kids was to have them play with stacks of money. So there's a picture of kids making a block tower out of stacks of money.
Yeah, so great question. It's actually a question in the chat. And I think this is a question for both of you.
Yeah.
So we're saying this happens in other countries, but we don't seem to have this problem. So I'm actually not sure. Are we having this problem? We're not having we have a budget deficit on the order of 6% of GDP. So that's pretty massive. 6% of GDP is like, so for example, if the US wanted to join the Eurozone, it would have to cut that in more than half. So the US wouldn't be allowed into the Eurozone based on like the profligate government spending. So this happens in other countries, but in the US, like somehow we can always find buyers for the IOUs. Is that how it works? Or like can this Argentina problem never happen here? Like
So
how does
it
it work?
did happen
Yeah.
here in the 80s and 90s. Interest rates were coming down very slowly until there was some really serious deficit cutting. There was huge pressures by these quote unquote bond vigilantes in the early 90s who were not wanting to buy government bonds and pushing up interest rates to lower the deficit. And that's ultimately why Clinton ended up balancing the budget. Now, those bond vigilantes have gone away for various reasons, but they can come back extremely quickly. And I think most economists are kind of worried that we're on a path where they will come back quickly. So just to give you two examples of where they came back quickly, one is Liz Truss in the UK just a few years ago. She passed a budget that people thought wasn't really putting the fiscal house in order. Interest rates spiked. She had to resign very, very quickly. Famously, there was the comparison between her and the head of lettuce, which one would be out of office, gone faster, and the lettuce outlasted her.
But Adam, can you just kind of explain one thing? So there's the interest rate that the central bank sets.
Yes.
That clearly in the UK didn't spike. But it was a different interest rate that spiked. Can you like say what is this other interest rate that spiked and what does that?
Sorry, I'm getting ahead of myself. Yeah. So the other interest rate is kind of the interest rate on long-term government debt, which is determined kind of in the marketplace. You can think of that as being related to Fed policy, but also related to kind of supply and demand for American bonds.
So that's like a market interest rate. So there's the interest rate that the Fed sets, which is kind of like deciding how much money gets printed in a way.
So that's a short-term interest rate.
Yeah.
You can think that the short-term interest rate is the long-term interest rate is kind of related to expected short-term interest rates in the future, but it's also determined by supply and demand. So both out there. So the other example I was going to give of bond vigilantes coming back is Greece in 2011.
Yeah, so they were asleep like between 2000 and 2011, and they woke up.
And
basically,
very, very suddenly, crisis in Greece as interest rates spike. And I think most economists feel like we are on a path that is not viable in the long run. It's just a question of when, not if. Granted, Japan has a much higher debt to GDP ratio than we do. but they're in a very weird situation where they have a lot of domestic demand for their bonds, in part because of the rapidly aging Japanese population and some other kind of institutional quirky factors.
I want to go back to Argentina for a moment. So David Milei, the president of Argentina, has been trying to put the pin back in the grenade, so to speak, in Argentina. So they're running a fiscal surplus. They're trying to make the central bank more independent. Is that working or is it not working? How are they feeling today?
Yeah, it's a it's there's a lot of grenades in Argentina and a lot of pins, and they're trying very hard to make rapid fire changes. Some of that itself is going to hurt the economy. I think the Argentinians have shown several times in the last few elections they're willing to suffer some pain because they know they can't keep going like they've been going for the last, let's say 50 years, but you could go longer than that. They have a very, very distorted economy. It's been decades of lots of strange regulations and practices that have distorted the economy in many ways and made the economy sort of not grow at all since, when I was a kid. But let me talk about the one grenade that's the most relevant today, which is the central bank. Yes, they've made a big impact on inflation. Inflation is sort of something like 30% per year by the latest numbers I saw, and it had been several 100% per year for a long time. So it is working, but they're making lots and lots of changes. And so I hope things turn out well for Argentina. The Argentinian people want a crazy person like Milei because they don't want anymore the sort of decades and decades of populist type policies. It's funny, Milei earns a lot of comparisons to Trump, but he's, other than saying sort of outrageous things, he's really not like Trump at all. The best comparison to Trump is Christina Kirchner, she was the one who fired the central bank president, my previous example. She was the one who just basically ran the printing presses full speed ahead and tried to then change the statistics showing that there wasn't any inflation, and sort of did all these moves that didn't fool too many people, but to try to pretend there wasn't inflation, and sort of there was, and the economy was sort of brought to a halt. It really impacted the way businesses work, the way households operate. It was really a huge constraint on economic activity for so long. People were just sick of it. That's why they picked a total outsider in Milei and gave him huge powers to make changes.
I see. So what is it about Argentina and other countries like that leads basically for 50 years to these recurring situations where I guess like after each of the crises they decided we're never going to touch the central bank again. We're never going to interfere. We're never going to make the central bank print money again. But then they end up doing it anyway. What is it fundamentally about these political systems that produces that result?
Yeah, it's a great question. It's a complicated political economy kind of issue. So a lot of what the Kirchner administration was doing, people talk about Peronismo, or I guess Peronism in Argentina. There's a lot of sort of populist examples. Erdogan is a lot like this, but so in Argentina they were literally printing money, and they would go into sort of poor neighborhoods and literally they'd have like a clipboard, and they would call out names, Hassan, Tarek, and then you'd come over and I'd hand you money. And I'd say, Guren, Adam, and then I'd hand you some money. And then I would just come in, and the economy was so terrible. This was sort of a big source of your income. Just the political machine just hands you money. But then they would say, oh, by the way, I hope you're not busy on Thursday because we have a huge, massive rally to support the Kirchners in this big upcoming election. And you'd sort of be bussed to a place and you'd be on a route. So it was this enormous political machine. My wife, who comes from Argentina, her relatives say it's just throwing enough coconuts to enough people to sort of have them, begrudgingly vote for you. And so it was just all about trying to win the next election. And it was like what Adam was saying at the beginning, and you were saying about you're just always trying to get enough short run sort of goodies given away that you get the election won. And so if you just have this short run mentality of how can we tear things apart and give things away in the short run, that over the long run, you pay huge consequences to that. It's not only the central bank independence, but the incredible thing about Argentina is that if you take my wife's relatives who left Italy around World War II, it was sort of equally rich, maybe like only slightly behind the US around that time. So imagine these Italians leaving Italy, and you can take one boat that goes to north to the US, to New York, another boat that goes south to Buenos Aires. You're sort of indifferent. And you look back 75 years later, nobody would pick Argentina now. It's the US is 5 times as rich in per capita terms as Argentina. So not only running the printing presses, but that has been it's been a recurring challenge, a recurring part of the problem since the beginning, this complicated political
But
process.
they've made themselves poor by constantly running into these. So if in some sense, so is it right to say that like you can get into a situation where a given party can only win if they juice the economy in this way, if they basically start printing money right before the election?
I feel like for a long time that was a good description and it seemed kind of hopeless, but they really, as much as you listen to some of the things Millet says, you think this guy's should be confined to a mental institution. People went out in droves, including a big sort of midterm election last fall, and voted for him and voted for him again. So they know it's going to be painful to change. But they sort of are tired of this process with just constant inflation, constant money printing, constant politicking. They're sick of it, and they twice, in big elections, gave him a mandate to change. So I sort of hope that there's a silver lining in all this, that some of these reforms pay off and that they put the grenade back in and you can get down to a stable sort of price system where it's not just rampant inflation year after year, month after month. Yeah.
Adam, I guess I have two questions for you. So the first is like, is there anything comparable in US history? And if so, what is stopping this sort of money printing business from happening here?
So there is something I think that is really comparable, which happened in 1972. So in 1970, Richard Nixon appoints his close friend and trusted advisor, Arthur Burns, as the Fed chair. Burns famously warned Nixon in the 1960 election that the Fed tightening was going to cost him the election, and he narrowly lost to John F. Kennedy. And in 1972, as we all know from Watergate, Nixon was really hell-bent on re-election. And he was particularly hell-bent on the Fed not getting in the way, given his memories from 12 years earlier. And on the Nixon tapes that came out after Watergate, he is constantly complaining and scheming about how to get Burns to lower the rates. And he understands that monetary policy has a lag, so he wants the rates to be low in the first quarter of 1972, from January to, say, April or May. And really pressures Burns, talking to him every 5 days, really getting in his ear. In his diary, which was published after his death, Burns wrote that the president's preoccupation with the election frightens me. Is there anything he would not do to further his reelection? And one thing that he did do, although the evidence is a little bit speculative, but I think it's there, is actually blackmail Burns. So at the time, there were price and wage controls. And what the White House did was leaked a fallacious story that Burns was trying to get a major pay increase for himself, despite everybody else dealing with the austerity of wage controls. And then they leaked another story that Nixon was so upset about this that he was considering packing the Fed board, adding more members to make it so Burns would be outvoted, limiting the Fed's independence statutorily and undermining the chairmanship. And they sent an envoy who, at least according to one of his biographers, was Alan Greenspan. And Greenspan went to Burns and said, you can make this all go away if you just lower interest rates. And sure enough, in the middle of a tightening cycle, when rates need to be tighter, he lowers rates to the point that the real interest rate, net of inflation, was negative, which is really stimulative. And he did that within 24 hours of receiving the ultimatum. And what happened 18 months later, in 1973, inflation took off. Of course, the Yom Kippur War and the OPEC embargo and the spike in the price of oil in 1973 also play a big role. And there's kind of a debate among economists about how much Burns mattered and how much other factors matter. But there's a recent paper by an economist named Thomas Dreschel at Maryland who analyzes episodes of presidential pressuring of the central bank and finds that they lead to higher inflation and no improvement of output or inflation. In other words, they're just bad. And that is why I think what Trump is doing right now is such a big problem in terms of constantly pressuring for lower interest rates, trying to get the Justice Department to prosecute Powell, although they dropped that recently so that Warsh could be confirmed. And that's why I think the most viral moment of Warsh's, Kevin Warsh, the Fed nominee, and I think at this point who will be confirmed, his confirmation hearing last week was when one of the senators said, "Are you Trump's sock puppet in human form?"
Yeah, Elizabeth Warren, I think, said that, right?
Yeah, because the
Um,
concern is that Trump is going to want lower interest rates and Warsh is just going to go along with it. And I think there really is this huge question of, is he going to be William McChesney Martin in 1951 or Arthur Burns in 1972?
so,
And
but guys,
ultimately,
again, sorry, but I think you just answered my question. So I asked, my second question was, what is keeping this from happening here? And I
what's
think
keeping
the
it,
answer is, yeah.
it's just the backbone of the Fed chair.
But what about all this stuff about like, oh, we looked at your mortgages and like we're gonna indict you on like your mortgage application, there's something wrong, and or like we went through your trash and we like that sort of stuff. So we basically need these people who get selected to the Fed board to basically just say, I don't care, indict me, I'm gonna sit here protecting the interest rates.
Yeah. Or ideally, we just don't, they're left alone as they have been by and large since Reagan. But
So David, do you also not see really much institutional? I guess I was sort of hoping you were going to say
Or
there's an institutional thing that's stopping this from happening here, and
yeah,
it's
no,
the
the
central bank.
courts. I agree with what Adam said, but I think the courts too play a very big role. So you're referring to the Lisa Cook, who is a board governor, is a Federal Reserve governor, and basically my understanding of that situation was they started with her, decided they want to get rid of her and replace her with somebody who was more pliant. And who was that person? I don't know, but they started with her, and they did an investigation and found that she had clicked the wrong box on a mortgage application and then fired her. And so the Supreme Court already has shown, I haven't followed all of I don't think it's decided yet, but so far it's been sort of favorable for her and for Fed independence, because so far they could have said the president can invent whatever cause and fire anybody for cause at any time. And at that point, any governor would just be an email away from being fired. And so at that point, there'd be just complete political control of the Fed. You'd have no independence whatsoever. It would be a political arm, like Christina Kirchner's central bank was a political arm of the government. So far, that doesn't seem we haven't quite gotten there yet. So far, the courts are protecting Fed independence, but there's still other decisions. There'll be other challenges. So the courts have not folded yet, but if they fold, we can forget about Fed independence as we know it.
And the worry, I think, is death by a thousand cuts. That each of these small actions kind of accumulates up to a perception that the Fed is not independent.
I can certainly tell you from my co-authors at the Fed and so forth that you hear from them quite frequently now. So, oh, I can't write that paper because that's going to cause some problems internally. So that's something that you hear more frequently now than you used to in the past. Okay, but so David, I guess like I'm curious, but maybe there might not be an easy answer to this. Famously, statutes like, so my guess is that like the central bank actually technically is also independent in Turkey and in Argentina, but it's just not true in practice because
No, legally in Argentina, it's an arm of the Christina Kirchner passed a law later saying that the president basically controls the Fed. So no, legally, Milei has tried to undo that. That's been one of the thousands of changes he's made. Turkey, I don't know whether it's technically independent, and it's also not, there's shades of gray. Like Adam, when we were chatting last week, mentioned the Alesina Summers paper. It's a famous paper of the 90s where they sort of measure on a scale of 1 to 5 how independent Feds are. So Turkey must have some independence, but it sort of took a terrible inflation in the case of Turkey, plus appointing of some really good people, including Fatih Karahan, who was at the New York Fed. Now he's head of the central bank in Turkey. He's a hawk. It took appointing a good person and a change of heart on the president to try to right the ship there. But yeah, technically, I don't I sort of interrupted. I didn't know what your question was. Technically, are they legally? How independent are they? They're less independent than ours, but yeah, they're moving in the right direction. Both of those places.
And just to complete the thought there, the paper that you referred to, Alcina Summers, they don't just rate the central banks, they then compare that to long-run inflation, and they show that less independent central banks have higher long-run inflation,
Right.
and more
Right.
independent central banks have lower long-run.
Yep.
So what happens to sort of what does it mean for normal people if you have high inflation? Why are we so worried about this?
So can I give an example? So I bought, I don't know why I did this, but I wanted to use Treasury Direct. I don't know if any of our users have gone on Treasury Direct because I heard about it. I know our colleague Larry Kotlikoff kept talking about it. So I said, I'm going to buy a government bond on Treasury Direct. So I bought a 30-year bond, not a very big one. And I get a $50 payment every fall and a $50 payment every spring. So this is hardly going to cause me economic success or ruin if things go badly, but I get that every fall and spring for 30 years, and then they return the original $2,000 that I bought the bond for. So if central bank becomes less independent and we get a big bout of inflation, think about what those dollars, they're going to return to me $2,000. It's not adjusted for inflation. So in 30 years, that could be a pretty significant chunk of money, or it could be the kind of thing where, like, if your child says, "Hey, Dad, can I borrow $2,000?" You say, "Whatever," and you hand them $2,000. Then you go on with what you're doing. It could be a small piece of money. It could be if you have another inflation episode like the 70s, that could be sort of worthless. I'm getting a fixed payment of $50 every fall and every spring. Every single year, those things could be less and less valuable. So if you're locked into long-term nominal bonds, inflation is going to be very bad news for you. If you have a TIPS that's adjusted for inflation, and if the Fed doesn't, the government doesn't do like Christina Kirchner and lie about what the inflation is, maybe you're protected, but something like 15% of debt right now is adjusted for inflation TIPS. The rest is nominal, and it's very much exposed to inflation. So that's one area where you could be very exposed as a normal person. I mean, as a big investor too, that's obviously a big worry. So that's one answer.
I mean, when
Yeah.
if you survey people, the answer is they think their wages aren't keeping up and they're poor. It's just a nuisance. Think back to 2022 when, usually you don't really have to think about how much you have to save month to month or how you budget because of inflation. And it's 2%, it's low, it might as well be close to zero. When it really picks up, you start having to think the mental math, the rebudgeting, the nuisance of putting aside more money. People hate inflation. I mean, you
And
look
we're
at the results
defaulting
of the last
on,
presidential election, people hate inflation.
yeah. But can I just make a distinction here? So I feel like the COVID inflation shock and also the inflation shock that we're living through now are not happening because the central bank is juicing the economy. Those are two shocks that basically happened because it got harder to make things. So during COVID, you couldn't produce things as well because you had to space out your workers, and it was hard to go get around, and it was hard to get inputs and so forth. And that's why things got more expensive. So that's like a supply shock that makes people poorer. I think, Adam, what you're talking about is that, if you just have sort of okay, we're just going to start printing money and monetizing the federal deficit, that's a different type of inflation where in theory everybody should be keeping up. But I think in practice, people, like pensioners or people who have some kind of fixed income, like David's example, get left behind. Is that the issue?
I want to caution you on the interpretation of COVID. There are some people who kind of tell the story that you tell. There are other people who say, no, we did trillions and trillions of dollars of fiscal stimulus. Federal spending was hugely high. We really expanded the debt. We put a lot of money in people's pockets, which they spent down over quite a while. And in fact, if you kind of looked at how big the gap, what we call the output gap is, how much lower output is than it could be, we were spending and handing people way more than that. And that's what caused the inflation. So maybe a little bit of each, but I think it's important to point out that there is a link potentially between the Fed, the fiscal policy and inflation.
In this episode in particular, yeah.
So Adam, I want to talk about your Wall Street Journal piece that came out,
Washington Post.
Washington Post that
It's
came
like
out. When did it come out? Like last
2
week?
weeks ago. Yeah.
You wrote there that the nominee for Fed chair is leaning on a myth. What is the myth?
So how did Warsh reportedly convince Trump that he was a low interest rate guy? By all accounts, and based on what he said, he's been doing this based on basically saying that, hey, we're going to have this AI revolution, and it's going to be just like the 90s when computerization was rampant and Alan Greenspan kept rates low and we were able to have a lot more growth without inflation. And the myth is this myth of Alan Greenspan in the 90s. There are, I think, a number of questions about will AI look like computerization in the 90s and what will it do and what's the right interest rate response. I kind of sidestepped that a little bit, although I'm happy to get into it here, and focused instead on what Warsh was saying about how the Fed should be collecting information. And essentially what he said is, we don't want to be data dependent. We don't want to be backward looking. The data is going to be slow here. We're going to need to go out and talk to business people and collect anecdotes. And we're going to have to make a bet based on our gut and our instinct, just like Alan Greenspan did in the 90s. And my op-ed was said basically, that's not what Alan Greenspan did in the 90s. In the 90s, Alan Greenspan was more data dependent than anybody else. He drilled deeper into the data than anybody else. And yes, the data is problematic and lousy, but Warsh really needs to keep an eye on the data and can't say that he knows better than the data because he talks to some people in Silicon Valley. So I think that's one of the dangerous things about Warsh. The other one, which the hearings really focused on was, will he be independent? Will he be the sock puppet or not?
Yeah.
Ultimately, I think, that is something where you can't really test if someone has that degree of backbone and that degree of being able to put up with your feet being held to the fire until you're sitting there in the chair making policy. And earlier I said, is he going to be Martin in 51 or Burns in 72? I think that's something I wish I could find out whether he has that type of mettle, but I don't think we can. He's saying all the right things about lionizing Paul Volcker, but talk is easy, action is hard, especially when the president who just appointed you is going to be extremely upset if you don't do what he thinks he appointed you to do.
So I guess you can expect if you don't lower interest, if he gets into office and doesn't lower interest rate, I guess you can expect somebody to like go and check his mortgage records right away.
I think you're going to see, who knows what they have on him, but there's a lot in that financial disclosure that was confidential, and I'm less worried about why he's rich and how he made the money, and more worried that there's something there that could be used to blackmail him. And that's why I'm really worried he hasn't disclosed more.
So David, from outside the US, so those are the people who buy our IOUs in no small measure.
Yep.
Those people live outside of the US. And so when and if like a bond vigilante moment would happen in the US, that would be decided outside of the US, not here. So how does that interact with sort of the perceptions of a potentially politically compromised Fed chair? So if we created the impression that like a sock puppet is coming in, what would happen, or how would that affect things?
For international buyers of bonds, people outside the US. Yeah, it wouldn't be good news. Let me plug, we had the previous one, we talked about cryptocurrencies, and I feel like we were talking about the dollar, and I feel like I plugged Ken Rogoff's book then. Let me plug it again now. It's a great book if anyone's looking for a good read on the sort of, let's say, monetary economics. The title of the book is Our Dollar, Your Problem. And it was a quote from somebody in the
Valerie
US
just
government
started to sting.
who was
No. This
it
is
was
like
a
a
US
Texas senator.
No, it was a US person for sure, because they were in Europe, and Europe was saying exactly, man, you guys, it's the 70s. You guys have so much inflation right now. All these dollars just getting what about all these dollar debt? Just like my 30-year bond, they held a lot of those 30-year bonds, and I have $2,000 worth of debt. The Europeans had a rather larger number than $2,000 written at the top of their IOUs. And this US person
It was John
said,
Connolly, who was the Fed Treasury Secretary at
John
the
Connolly,
time, fighting
right.
with Valéry Giscard d'Estaing, who was the French Prime Minister at the time.
Now this time, I
And
think.
so, right. So he was the
It trips
Secretary
me
of the
up.
Treasury and said, it's our dollar, your problem. So we do what I want with our dollar and tough luck for you. And that's not likely to sit well with allies. It's not likely to be good. Somebody's question earlier, I have to look in the chat, but it was Duff's question, maybe we can borrow forever. So, or not, that wasn't literally what he said, but maybe we can borrow a lot more, but without changing interest rates. Well, if we start doing that to people, no, we're going to run out of buyers really quickly. It's going to be much harder to sell our debt if we're inflating on them. So yeah, it's not going to be good news for other people, but it's not going to be good for us when we turn around and try to sell debt later. Just like Argentina, nobody wants a peso denominated Argentinian bond. Even a US dollar bond is tough because they default on you, but that's a different story.
There's a question in the chat about quantitative easing.
Yeah, isn't that the same thing? Isn't that like the Fed buying a bunch of bonds that it shouldn't be buying?
So it's a little bit different. And so let me go back. Where did quantitative easing come from, and what is it, and how does this relate to today? So in 2008, the Fed hit what's known as the zero lower bound on interest rates. You can't push the short rate below zero because basically no one's going to buy a short-term bond with a negative rate. You might as well hold cash instead, which has a zero rate. And so the Fed still wanted to stimulate the economy. There are other interest rates like the mortgage interest rate, long-term bond rates that are what we call spreads, the gaps above the short rate because they're longer-term bonds or they have some sort of risk. And so what the Fed did was try to push down those rates, even though the short rate was stuck at zero, by buying those types of bonds. They first bought mortgage-backed securities to kind of put a floor under the housing market in 2008. But quantitative easing 2 and 3 were the more controversial ones when in 2010 through 2012, 2014, in various rounds, Bernanke led the Fed in pursuing additional quantitative easing because Congress was kind of intransigent. There was a slow recovery, and they wanted to be able to stimulate the economy further without but they couldn't lower rates anymore. And one of the people who was really upset about the second round of quantitative easing was a young Fed governor named Kevin Warsh, who voted for the policy, but then famously resigned over it and wrote an op-ed in the Wall Street Journal bashing it. And since then has said that the Fed was basically doing quasi-fiscal stuff and should get out of that business, and that it was distortionary and creating all these problems. This has led to a big intellectual debate with Ben Bernanke, who says, actually, the costs of this quantitative easing policy aren't that high, and it's a great way, if we need to, it's a great extra tool to have. Now, Bessent, who's the current Treasury Secretary, and Warsh are kind of ascendant. They think this is a terrible idea. And one of the things that Warsh is really committed to do is shrink the size of the balance sheet. So why did the balance sheet go up? Because in quantitative easing, you're buying tons and tons of these long-dated securities. Now the Fed has to figure out how to get rid of them without being unstimulative. And the answer for a while has been kind of slowly wind them down. But that ran into a big problem in 2019 when the Fed briefly lost control of the Treasury rate, and there was these huge problems in the Treasury market. And so there's kind of a view right now that the Fed cannot reduce its balance sheet too much because it's going to cause problems in the financial plumbing. Nonetheless, Warsh, his big thing is he's going to reduce the size of the balance sheet. And I think this leads to a big question of how is he going to do this? How is he going to prioritize financial stability and financial market stability with shrinking the size of the balance sheet? His answer is, I'm going to do it slowly, and I have to change regulation. But I think there's a real concern about changing regulation with the goal of shrinking the Fed's balance sheet instead of changing financial market regulation because of concerns about how financial markets are regulated and risk in financial markets. And so I think there's a kind of a big question mark as to when these two things come into conflict. What is Warsh going to do? Is he just going to say that's a quasi-fiscal thing? The Fed shouldn't be in this business, and not intervene, or is he going to say financial plumbing is in trouble? Even after I have to go against my word and grow the size of the balance sheet, I need to do it. And if
So
he,
I want to put a finer point on this and bring it back to David. I think this is a very good point, but I want to maybe say it a little bit more bluntly. So the thing that is keeping me up at night is we have a fiscal deficit of 6% of GDP. It's kind of like Egypt. It's pretty much, I think, roughly the same ballpark in terms of percentage of GDP. And there's no clear path for budget consolidation. Meaning, like, I don't really see the political actors who are trying to bring this number down. And I think that might lead us to a point where, so Hank Paulson, the former Treasury Secretary, already kind of wrote an op-ed about we need a plan for what happens when the bond vigilantes wake up and stop buying the US Treasury's debt. Meaning, what happens if the foreigners are no longer willing to buy the US Treasuries? David, what's going to happen? What's going to happen to the central bank? And what decisions would a new future Fed chair have to make?
If there's a huge drop off in the demand for these.
So I think it's interesting that
So
Adam was referring to a similar. So you can call this a problem with the financial plumbing, or you can call it the foreigners are no longer buying the bonds,
right.
and then something needs to be done very quickly.
there are different concepts here, I think. One's about.
Well, let me go with this for a second, and maybe you guys can tell me what the difference is.
Yeah.
So, but let's go through the scenario. So let's say actually the Fed needs to decide: are we gonna monetize? Are we gonna monetize the deficit or not? What's gonna happen? Just from that's a political decision basically that the Fed is gonna have to make. What do you think is gonna happen?
It's a good question. So just as a mechanical issue, you're going to have much higher interest payments on any new debt. So it's going to sort of add fuel to the fire in the sense that if we're already having trouble, we're already having a deficit. Now we have to pay more for every additional dollar we borrow. That's going to just sort of amplify things. So first of all, we're not going to find ourselves in a good situation if we're there. It's not that I don't think that it's possible that we go there. It's just right now the demand is so high for our bonds. It's hard for you to imagine that things dry up all of a sudden, but if they sort of phase out, sort of it's starting to get signs that they phase out. I don't know. I do think you might have some temptation for the Fed to buy those things, and we're going to get some inflation, and we're going to inflate away a lot of that debt. I think the pressure on just the US in general is going to be high to do that. So I don't know if that's where you're sort of asking me if I think that's likely. I would say that yes, unfortunately, I do think that's likely. I think that the temptation to is there going to be outright default on debt? That seems like a really extreme scenario right now. But if you want to sort of partially default on people, then you have inflation run a little high, and then people like me who have nominal bonds pay some of those costs through inflation. And so I think that's likely if that's where you're asking me.
So I think if the foreigners stop buying all of our bonds, interest rates will rise. The Fed thinks about itself as kind of on the gas, on the brake, or kind of in neutral. And that neutral rate, interest rate, is going to go up. Interest rates will rise. I think there's going to be a lot of people upset. And, if the 80s and 90s are any guide, and I think what the bond markets are certainly betting on, is that the Fed will keep a lid on inflation, at least in the short run. And the interest rate will rise, and there'll be a huge amount of pressure on the fiscal authorities to get their house in order. And people are betting that they will by some combination of budget cuts and tax increases when the bond vigilantes come back and pressure us to do so. I think the big question is if they do that successfully, great. If they don't do that successfully, and then it goes to the Fed to say, is there going to be inflation, or is there going to be some standoff with the fiscal authority, and interest rates keep going up and up and up, and Congress is under more and more pressure but won't do anything? And how that plays out, I think, is anything but obvious. So those are kind of the two paths. But I think at first we'll see interest rates going up to keep a lid on inflation, and a big debate in our country about the size of the government and the level of taxes, and it's going to be painful.
Yeah. So I think this is like often very confusing for people. So the I think the key thing here is that the Fed controls one interest rate, which is the short-term interest rate. But the interest rate that the government pays on its debt could get divorced from the interest rate that the Fed is controlling. Is that what you're saying? So basically, although we're not changing the interest rate that the Fed is charging at the short end, the long-term borrowing cost for the government could go up, and that could create pressure because more and more of the budget will have to go towards just paying interest on the things that you already borrowed. Is that what's happening? Or is that what you're saying? Did that make sense, Adam? Or no?
That's what I was saying. Yeah, I thought you were asking Adam, but yes, for sure. Yeah. Do we have time to take some questions from?
Yeah, I asked in the chat, like if you, if there's any final questions, please shoot. If not, I'm going to ask both of you my last question, which is, so I guess like this is what people are really here for. So we've talked about a lot of kind of details here. In your honest read, is what we're watching at the Fed and also on the fiscal side, is that a political storm that's going to pass the way that kind of the Nixon attacks on the Fed have passed, or the Trump-Powell feuds in the first term? I think people forget that Powell was nominated by Trump also, as far as I remember. Or is something structurally changing here about this U.S. institution? So just your honest read on that. We have 2 minutes, so 1 minute each.
I hope and pray that it's a blip. I think, in my mind, not to completely change the direction, a big question is what's going to happen with AI. Is there going to be a lot of economic growth? Is everything going to be hunky-dory? If so, maybe we can grow ourselves out of this mess in terms of government policy. But we seem to be banking a lot on that. And if we don't, we're going to have to make some hard choices. And if politicians aren't willing to make hard choices, things are going to get bad on the inflation front or on some other front. And, this is a ticking time bomb, and it's just a question of when we address it.
David?
I think the most likely outcome is that there's reasonable monetary policy over the coming years and that we sort of avoid this. But I assign a pretty non-negligible probability to sort of learning the hard way, where we go down the path of very low interest rates, long rates, as you said, which can be easily divorced from short rates, start rising as people anticipate inflation, like Adam was emphasizing, that plus the inflation could be a painful period having the inflation. Then it could be a painful period like during the 80s when Volcker had to raise rates through the roof. Turkey had to raise interest rates through the roof to get its inflation down. If we go through that, the current generation will sort of, who's forgotten or just never knew about the inflation of the 70s. They never even thought about this. Students, it's like you said, you talk about Fed independence and inflation, it's sort of boring, but this will make it a lot less boring, and they'll sort of may have to learn the hard way what the value of central bank independence is. So I hope we don't go down that path, but it's certainly possible.
Adam Guren, David Lagakos, I'd like to thank you for your time today. I'd like to thank our participants online, and hopefully we'll see all of you soon.